Here we go. Starting in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Hey, Econ students, this is Jacob Clifford. You've been watching my videos for several days now, so here I am live to help you out because today is the day. This is it. I saw you guys in the chat. Looks like you're super excited. I'm excited for you. First of all, I know it's been tough. Life is crazy, but you guys got this. You've put the time and energy. This is probably your last AP test. For many of you, the last AP test you're ever going to take. So, but College Board, they're done. You never have to deal with them again. So yeah, congratulations to all of you, and all of you are graduating. I'm making this short video to give you some tips and strategies here at the very, very end. I'm not going to be on for very long, so keep that in mind. I'm only going to be talking here for about maybe 30 minutes max, just to give you some tips and strategies. Now, yesterday, a lot of people said, because we had micro yesterday, that some of the tips I gave you and particularly the predictions I made were pretty accurate. So I'm hoping that's the case today. We're about to find out right now. Let me know real quick if my audio is working, doing good. It looks like you guys are saying love you. Oh, I love you too. This is so kind. I appreciate it. You guys are awesome. Okay, so let's jump first into all this stuff. First of all, I mean, this is all that you need to know. So no Unit 6, you already know that. There's 2 fair responses. You already know that. You've probably taken multiple AP tests at this point. So, which is you're up and running. You know how this works. There's not gonna be any graphs that you have to draw. They might give you a graph. On microeconomics, apparently what I've heard is it focused on marginal analysis. It gave you charts. And that's why I think when it comes to this fair response, you're going to see in 3 hours, they're going to focus on the big picture stuff, the biggest ideas that you need to know. And that's what I'm going to talk about right now. So here we go. First of all, I don't care if you have my ultimate review packet or another resource, but you got to have stuff up and running and ready. Obviously, there are some key graphs of this course, and they are right here. So production possibilities curve, aggregate demand and supply, Phillips curve, money market, loanable funds. Don't worry about foreign exchange. Not going to be on the test. That's Unit 6. So this actually makes your test significantly easier. Again, they might give you one of these graphs. What I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on what my predictions are going into it. If you haven't already watched it, I've made several videos for you. With this last hour left, there's a couple things I want you to do. Inside the link below, there's everything you need to know video that explains the course in like less than 30 minutes. So you want to watch that as you're waiting. You log in early for the College Board. As you're waiting, go ahead and watch that video to get concepts kind of back in your brain. So that's going to help you. And then, here's my predictions of what I think it's going to be. And so let's just jump straight into it. Okay, so there's several different types of questions you might see. The first ones, as you know, and you've seen this stuff before, might see the idea of comparative advantage. Now, this is a comparative advantage question they gave back in 2016. I don't think it's going to be comparative advantage for you guys. And my reasoning is because if you told me that I had to test students 2 questions that cover all of macroeconomics, comparative advantage wouldn't be like, oh, that's the most important thing. There's other more important things, fiscal, monetary policy, unemployment, inflation, GDP kind of stuff. But you might see it. So I think some of you guys might see this. A couple things you need to know is, absolute advantage, how to calculate per unit opportunity cost. I'm not going to do that in this video, but if you need to go practice, look at the Unit 1 practice sheet where you practice the idea. And of course, make sure you understand the idea of terms of trade. So trading one donut for how many cupcakes would benefit both individuals or benefit both countries. So that is a skill question. The reason why I don't think you're going to have it is, number one, it's a calculation thing, and so students could potentially cheat because they could just tell each other answers. That's one. 2, I think the other reason why is because it's not that big of a concept that you need to know. Particularly for the AP macro exam. So anyways, this is a sort of question you might see. If you feel super uncomfortable, then you need to go do maybe a couple of practice questions, but don't spend all your time on this. Instead, you might see a question that would involve something like this. Now, I don't think it's going to be this, but I'm just showing you. This is kind of the unemployment kind of question where they give you number of people employed, understanding how to calculate the unemployment rate, the labor force participation rate. These are all equations that you know and you have access to in your book. So again, I don't think it's going to be on this, but they could ask you these kind of questions. Notice both of these questions I just showed you, these are calculation questions. The AP test, as you know, because you've taken a lot of them, they're going to require that you explain. If you see the word explain, you have to explain. It would not be enough just to say 12, right? So you have to fully explain that idea. Some people have asked me, is it better to write out your answers or to type out your answers? For me, I'd rather type them and upload them. But make sure you know you're going to have to explain terms of trade if you have a comparative advantage, or how did you get a comparative advantage? Explain your answer. For these ones, they might ask you a question like this. These are all the calculation questions from Unit 2. So this would be unemployment. There might be a GDP question where they actually have you calculate GDP given, some output. There might be a CPI question or a GDP deflator. Now, hopefully you know all these concepts that I'm showing you. This is all from Unit 2. If you don't know any of this, go look at the Unit 2 practice sheet that I have uploaded here on YouTube. It's also part of my ultimate review packet, but I gave that to students to help them with COVID-19 for just this year. So if you need help with that kind of thing, take a look at that. But I'm telling you, I don't think it's that. I'll be honest. I just don't think it's that, because again, students can cheat. It's a calculation thing. If you have the equations, you're fine. I think it's going to be, if you're going to see a calculation question, it's going to look a little bit more like this. So this is the spending multiplier. This is a free response that was given years ago. Basically, you've got a horizontal short-run aggregate supply curve. I know it's weird to some of you. That seems weird. Just understand the idea that there's a gap here of $400, and we're trying to close this gap. So a couple tips to watch out for this one. Just remember that when we're using fiscal policy, a change in government spending, in this case an increase in government spending, has more of an effect than taxes, because people save a portion of a tax cut. So if we were to cut taxes by a certain amount, we have to cut taxes by a greater amount than increasing government spending to close this same gap. Now also remember the spending multiplier is 1 over the marginal propensity to save, and you should be able to calculate that. Also keep in mind, they only ask you certain ones, like it's either 0.1, 0.2, 0.5, and you can calculate the multiplier from these marginal propensity to consume or to saves. They might ask you and give you the marginal propensity to consume. I mean, you know this what I'm talking about, but if they say, okay, marginal propensity to consume is 0.9 right there, then the marginal propensity to save is 0.1, because these have to add up to 1. And so marginal propensity to save is 1. When you throw that in the multiplier, that would pop out 10. Anything you multiply will get multiplied times 10. Now that's the spending multiplier, not the tax multiplier. So if we're trying to close a gap of 400, then a initial spending of $40 billion, whatever this is, times 100 is going to close that entire gap, because it becomes 400. Does that make sense? This is pretty ugly, but hopefully you understand the idea. This is nothing new to you. It might be something you see. Now, they might not do it in a graph. They can just do this in words just as easy. They can say, okay, the gap is 400. The marginal propensity to consume is 0.9. What is the least amount of government spending that can close the gap? Also keep in mind that if the spending multiplier is 10, the tax multiplier is always 1 less. Always, always, always mathematically. So the tax multiplier has 1 less ripple effect in the economy. Now, hopefully you understand that this is all theory. Like, it's in real life right now with this current recession and craziness, it's not this simple. But hopefully you understand that, this is what you need to know for the test. Real life gets more complicated. That's why you're going to take more econ classes in college. So this is the kind of question you see. This is a calculation question that requires you to know the spending multiplier, understand that taxes have less an effect, and know how to use that spending multiplier, and more importantly, be able to explain the multiplier effect. So understand, if they asked a question like this, why would an increase of spending of 40 billion end up being more than just the initial spending? And you'd be able to explain the multiplier. When people get income, they save a portion and then spend the rest. That becomes somebody else's income. They spend a portion, then save the rest, and the whole thing gets multiplied. So that's the idea of what you might see from that. Now, I don't think it's going to be that either. I'll be honest. I think I'm at the point where I can make a judgment call here. I don't think it's going to be comparative advantage, and I could be wrong. I mean, 3 hours, we're going to find out. I don't think it's going to be unemployment. I don't think it's going to be a GDP or CPI question. And I don't think it's going to have the majority of it like this be a calculation question. I think what it's going to be is a question. Oh, by the way, there's one more. Hold on. There's one more kind of calculation question. You know exactly what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a bank balance sheet. I talked about this in the last review session. Bank balance sheets, the idea of assets and liabilities, I don't think it's going to be this either. I'll be honest. I just don't think it's going to be this because, again, students potentially could cheat, don't cheat. But, this isn't all of macro. When I want a question and I'm a college board, I want to ask you a question that's so big that, like, this is macroeconomics and this, like, comparative advantage is a side thing. But you need to know it just in case so you understand liabilities are all the things that people have deposited in this bank. That's demand deposits. And then assets, this is what the bank has done with that money. There's required reserves and excess reserves. Sometimes, watch out, these just might be called reserves, right? So it's, if you just see the word reserves, it's both excess and required. You've got to be able to calculate the reserve requirement like it says here. So if there's 100,000 in demand deposits and there's a required 10,000, that must be 10% or 0.1. You can write either one of them fine, the reserve requirement. And then understand the idea of if someone deposits money or if someone withdraws money and the idea of open market operations. Again, these are all concepts you've seen. If you haven't seen them, don't worry. I'm going to help you out. I've got the Unit 4 practice sheet that you can go take a look at right now if you need to. Kind of pick and choose what you need to do. I don't think you need to spend, like I said, a lot of time in Unit 1. But if you don't know Unit 4, then you want to go check that out. Okay, all the things I showed you are not what I think could be on your test. I think comparative advantage, not it. I don't think it's GDP, unemployment. I don't think it's going to be bank balance sheets. I think it's going to be a question very similar to what they've done in the past. So I think what they're going to do, instead of having you draw the graph, they're going to describe a situation to you. So U.S. economy is operating below full employment. That means there's a negative output gap. They might actually use that term. So negative gap or a recessionary gap. And then they'd ask you all sorts of questions like, okay, at the current output, what's the relationship between the potential GDP and the real GDP or our actual GDP? And you'd say, okay, our actual GDP is less, and they maybe connect that to unemployment, right? And you understand that when there's a negative output gap, what kind of unemployment do we have? Right now, let me know in the chat, what kind of unemployment do we have when there's a negative output gap? Go ahead and tell me, because I guarantee that many of you will be wrong, because every single year people say the same thing. They go, oh, okay, it's cyclical unemployment, right? No, it's cyclical, frictional, and structural unemployment. Remember, we have all three. So they could ask you a question on that. There's a negative output gap. Describe the types of unemployment that occurs, right? You understand there's all unemployment. Normally, at full employment, we don't have cyclical, but if there's negative output gap, then we do. I know you already know that stuff, but remember, there's all three when there's a recession. Then they'd ask you a question, maybe a shifting question. They could say, okay, if consumer spending goes up, describe what will happen on the graph. What will happen to the price level and the GDP or the output, right? Price level would go up, GDP would go up if consumer spending increased. So they could ask you a single shift. You wouldn't draw it on the graph, but you could explain it. I don't think that's what's going to, it might be that. I think it's going to be fiscal and monetary policy. If I was writing one question or two questions for my students, I'd ask about fiscal and monetary policy. So here's what we're going to do right now. I know you've probably seen this before, but I think this is going to help you out. I did this in the Unit 5 breakdown. The review session I did as part of the Ultimate Review Packet. I'm going to do it again with you guys because I think it's going to be super helpful. So just jump on board with me. Just by looking at it, let me know in the chat what type of unemployment is, or what kind of, what's happening in this economy. Just by looking at it, you should know is that full employment, negative output gap, positive output gap. And over here, you should also know what curve that is. Notice, I did not label these. You know this is aggregate demand and aggregate supply. What's this over on the right-hand side? We've got unemployment, inflation, that is the Phillips curve. Okay? This is a negative output gap. So we are not producing at full employment. That's a concept. Notice I'm using graphs, even though you don't need to draw the graphs, but using the graphs are going to help you conceptually, especially what I'm about to show you. So let's say we're right here at point A, right? The question is, where's point A over here? You know where we are. Point A is here. This is showing the idea of low output, and we have some inflation, and here we have low output over on this side. So we have high unemployment over here. So it's not an unemployment amount. We have three types, all three, frictional, structural, cyclical. Okay. So they could get you in a situation where you have to explain where we are, and then they can ask you these questions. And I think this is where the test is going to ask you the most stuff. So if you're going to pay attention to one thing right now, this is it. When there's a negative output gap, really there's only three options. There's fiscal policy, monetary policy, and no policy. Fiscal policy is two things: increase in government spending or a cut in taxes. You know that. These things shift aggregate demand. So let's actually go show that up here really quickly. That's T for taxes. That's an arrow, the ugliest arrow, down arrow you ever seen in your life. So an increase in government spending would shift aggregate demand. That would lead to point B. Point B would be right here. That's what they can ask you on this question. They could ask you things like an increase in government spending, what would it do to aggregate demand? What would it do to price level, right? They could ask you, is that going to shift the short-run Phillips curve? The answer is no. It just moves along the short-run Phillips curve. Now we have higher inflation and less unemployment. Now this concept, this is the idea of fiscal policy. For monetary policy, right, we could do the same exact result. It's going to shift aggregate demand. So this graph describes the idea of monetary policy, but it's a different way of doing it. It's the central bank. Three things, let me know in the chat, what are the three things the central bank can do to close that gap? This should be just quick. You got this. You can decrease the reserve requirement, decrease the discount rate, or the central bank can buy bonds. Each one of these things would increase the money supply. Increase in the money supply, that's ugly. I'll say it again. Decrease the reserve requirement, decrease discount rate, or the central bank can buy bonds. In that case, by the way, which one of those is open market operations? The AP test loves the term. This is open market operations. It's what happens the most often. So just if you see open market operations, we're not talking about buying bonds and selling bonds, the central bank. Again, notice this causes the same thing. Aggregate demand would shift to the right. This would move along the Phillips curve. This is the idea of fiscal or monetary policy. Now, that said, what they'll do on these questions is they'll usually take it to the next step. Now, they'll ask you, okay, if you understand aggregate demand and supply and you understand fiscal policy, then what would happen if there's a bunch of governments borrowing to loanable funds? I don't have that graph here, but they take this usually to the next question, which is, okay, if the government's going to borrow a lot, right, and they're not going to tax much, they're going to have a budget deficit, what happens to loanable funds? And then they might connect that to growth. Now, I'm going to cover this in a second. Just before I do, though, let me make sure you understand what happens down here is they would connect this and say, oh, this is connected to monetary policy, to the money market graph. So don't draw the money market graph, but describe what happens on the money market graph when those bonds are purchased, right? What happens to the nominal interest rate? These are the kind of questions you'd actually probably see. And again, if you can draw it and you understand it graphically, then you can explain it in words. So for the first loanable funds one, if the government does borrowing, government borrows, there's two ways of thinking of it. You probably know what I'm talking about. This would decrease the supply of private loanable funds available to the private sector. So supply of loanable funds would fall, and so the real interest rate would increase. Now this is key. Why? Because when the real interest rate goes up and we're trying to help the economy, that's actually gonna get in the way of it. And there's a concept that you know exactly what that's called. When the real interest rate goes up, when there's deficit spending right now, let me know in the chat the two-word answer of what this is. I'll give you a hint. It is crowding out. Not much of a hint, but now you know. Question is, how does crowding out affect growth? Well, higher interest rate will lead to less investment, which could actually, in the long term, slow down growth, right? That could be a potential thing. Now, they could do it that way, or they could skip all of this and just skip to growth and say, well, this government spending wasn't just on giving people money. This government spending was on roads and bridges and infrastructure. That government spending could lead to more growth. Now, notice, don't freak out about this. It all depends on the question. If you didn't know this, AP stands for answer the prompt. It's not like, there's one single thing that can happen in the real world economy. It all depends. So this government spending, if this government spending is on, and they tell you, okay, the government spending is on education, which increases human capital, what will that do to growth? That's more growth. If they said, well, this government spending leads to a budget deficit, which leads to a higher interest rate, how's that going to affect growth? Well, then growth would actually fall. So just follow the question. Also, if you didn't know this, and I'm sure you do, when you get something wrong, this is going to help some of you guys who took micro yesterday. When you get something wrong, if you just stick with that logic, you can still get the points. So if you said, okay, this went up, but it actually went down, but you stick with that logic, you're fine. You should know the key relationships. If you got my ultimate review packet, you know what I'm talking about in my cheat sheet. These are the key relationships. So understand, interest rates go up, investment goes down. This is the most important relationship of all of them. So you understand all these key relationships, and can explain them. Okay, now that loanable funds, this is the idea of fiscal policy, what you usually see. For monetary policy, it's the same idea, except we're looking at the nominal interest rate. Right? So they'd ask you, okay, what happens? Well, the supply for money would increase because the Fed is buying bonds. That would decrease the nominal interest rate, and that would lead to more investment, which is what's causing this curve up here to shift in the first place. Again, notice what I'm trying to show you right here. And first of all, I just covered like pretty much 80% of the fair responses they could ask you on fiscal monetary policy. Like seriously, everything we just covered. In fact, here's the deal. If you're with me right now, if you're like, yeah, I know what he's talking about. I've seen this. I got this. Dude, you're going to be fine. You're going to be fine. You're going to be fine. All right. That said, one last thing. If there's no policy, if instead of doing this and we shift aggregate demand, let's just do nothing, what's that going to do on that graph? I'll give you a hint. It's not going to shift aggregate demand. Let me know in the chat right now what's going to happen. I'm going to actually draw it down here for you so you can see it visually. If we have no policy and we wait for the recession to fix itself, right? So what can happen? Well, wages will eventually fall. The reason why I'm writing this down is because you're going to have to explain this. This is not something you just say, okay, this will happen. Wages and costs of resources fall. Why? Well, when we have a recessionary gap, right, not very many people are hiring workers, not very many people are buying concrete or steel, and so the price of workers and concrete and steel are all going to fall eventually over time. Might take a while. That means the short run aggregate supply is going to shift to the right. Short run aggregate supply would shift to the right. Notice that's different than up here. These had aggregate demand shift. This had short aggregate supply curve. This is the idea of a long run adjustment. Notice we're back at full employment. We have frictional and structural unemployment at the end, which is exactly where we were here, which is exactly why there's a vertical curve. This vertical curve occurs because we'll end up being at full employment eventually in the long run. Again, this is no policy. Now, usually there's not something they go with this. No policy is nothing, but you have to be able to explain. So that one thing I'm going to tell you is this is not something that you'd have to just, obviously you can't draw it this year, but you're going to have to be able to explain why wages falling would cause it to occur. They could ask you a relationship question about inflation, like if prices go down, how would that affect nominal interest rates? How would that affect real interest rates? Because, inflation. So I'll make sure you understand the idea. Everything I just showed you. Oh, by the way, whoa. We got to show you the most important thing here, the hardest thing. This was let's call this C, not to confuse you guys with up here. So A to C. We knew we started here at A. You tell me right now in words, where would C be on this thing, right? So where is C somewhere on this graph? Now, hard part is explaining that in words, right? How do you explain that in words? Well, C, price level fell, so we can't be up here. So if you put C here, that's wrong. It's got to be somewhere down here because the entire short run Phillips curve is going to shift. So you know the rule here. The rule is when the short aggregate supply shifts to the right, the short run Phillips curve shifts to the left. And that makes sense, right? We have lower prices, more output. We have lower inflation, less unemployment. So this is the idea. If you understood what I just showed you, you rock. You totally, completely rock. I do want you to point out, though, real quick, this is going to help you out, big picture idea. Anytime aggregate demand shifts, it does not shift the Phillips curve. Anytime aggregate supply shifts, that does shift the Phillips curve. So just understand that concept. Now notice, everything I just showed you is one side of this AP test. The other side would be if there was a positive output gap, which is just everything's the opposite. So in this case, there would be a decrease in government spending or an increase in taxes to slow down the economy. Aggregate demand would go down. For this one, you'd increase the reserve requirement, increase the discount rate, and the Fed could sell bonds. 1 year they did something, this again would slow down the economy, decreasing aggregate demand. One year they did something kind of tricky, so just be careful for this. If they ask you, okay, students memorize, buy bonds, make economy bigger, buy bonds. But they've asked a question like if commercial banks bought bonds. So remember, we're talking about for this one, buying bonds is a central bank is doing the buying. If commercial banks are doing the buying, then that means the central bank is doing the selling. So be careful for like little word problems like that where you understand exactly what it's saying. Don't just read, buying bonds, right? Understand what we're talking about here. And this last one, same exact situation except opposite. Wages eventually go up and short ag supply would shift to the left, putting us back at full employment. Super ugly, I apologize, but right there, this seriously is almost an entire response alone. If you understand what I'm showing you right there, then you were rocking, dude. You are totally, completely rocking. Now, the one thing I have not showed you that you already know, because we talked about it a little bit, is that money market graph. Right? I mentioned it earlier, but I didn't actually show it to you. So you understand the idea. Here's the money market graph. They could ask you why things are shaped the way they are. They probably won't, because you can go look that up on the internet really quick. So they wouldn't say, okay, why is the demand downward sloping? And you'd say, asset demand and transaction demand, and explain those concepts. But it's probably not going to be those questions. It's going to be more like shift questions. So when the central bank buys bonds, what happens on the money market graph? Describe what happens and what happens to nominal interest rate. Buying bonds, central bank does it, money supply shifts to the right, and the nominal interest rate were to fall. So you understand this idea. Again, this will lead to more investment and more consumer spending on interest-sensitive consumer goods, and this is monetary policy. Done. You feel good about that. The other thing I didn't show you was a triple shift in aggregate demand, which is right there. Triple shift looks like this. Economy is here. If we have more investment or more government spending that leads to like better education or more capital goods, then that could be a triple shift. The whole thing shifts outward. And this, my friends, stay with me right here. And I'm going to draw super small over to the side so you can see. This is like the production possibilities curve shifting outward. Same exact, that's the smallest production possibilities curve. It's so pretty. Capital goods, consumer goods. This curve shifting all the way out to the right is the same idea as this curve shifting to that curve. Dude, if you are with me right now, let me know. Just write, I'm with you in the chat. That'll tell me if you're feeling comfortable about this stuff. But really, those are like the big concepts that you're going to see on this test. The last one that I have not shown you graphically is the Lorenz curve. Not Lorenz, the Loanable Funds market, Lorenz curve. Loanable Funds market, which is this graph. It's just supply and demand for loans. There is a trick that might help you out. Remember, if you want to write this down, the demand is always by borrowers and the supply is by lenders. Now, lenders are also savers. So if there's a question that says there's less saving in an economy, that means supply would shift to the left. So just be careful about that idea. Lenders, a lot of students think, if there's less savings, then people are going to borrow less because they're saving their money as opposed to borrowing. Nah. Savings create the supply of loanable funds. So when you put money in the bank and you save money, that allows that bank to make more loans. If you were to be saving less for whatever reason, or other countries are saving less in your country, done. So again, that's loanable funds. The easiest graph in the world is right there. I don't think it's going to be on the production possibilities curve, but gosh, I've been wrong before. I've told my students in the past, there's no way the production possibilities curve is on this test, but sometimes it's on there. It's so easy, and they're not going to ask you, show unemployment. You obviously understand that, and your book could give you the right answer every single time anyway. So I wouldn't freak out about that. Again, here's my prediction for you guys. I think, first of all, there's going to be a bunch of different versions. So there's several different versions. You already know that going into it. I think you're going to see questions. They're going to focus on fiscal and monetary policy, understanding shifts in aggregate demand and supply, explaining what happens with monetary policy, and possibly in the situation I showed you earlier, some sort of calculation question where they say, okay, so you understand what happens. So if this was 200 and this was 300 and you want to close this gap of 100 and we give you a marginal propensity to consume, can you explain the minimum amount that the government could spend to close that gap, or the minimum amount we could cut taxes to close that gap? So that's one of the questions they could ask you that requires some calculation stuff. It wouldn't be hard to ask multiple students different things because then they just change up those numbers. So this would be 50 and they change that to 500. Now there's new numbers, and so students would, if they're trying to cheat, they'd mess up. So don't cheat. Okay, hopefully that was helpful for you guys. The one thing, if at this point, if you're like, I don't know anything you just said, Mr. Clifford, inside the description below, there's a everything you need to know video that's going to go over the entire unit over again. Don't watch the last unit. Also, the units are a little off because I made the video several years ago, but it's a good video and it's going to have all the concepts in there for you. But for the most part, that's what you're going to see here on your test coming up in 2.5 hours. Do me a favor though, when you're done. So a couple favors. First one, make sure to subscribe. If you haven't subscribed, that's weird. And I know you're not gonna watch these videos when you're off in college and stuff, but subscribing tells YouTube I'm doing good stuff and helping students. So please do that and like this video. And then do me a big favor, come back. I think you're allowed to talk about the AP test after the AP test this year. I don't know, but come back and let me know in the comments below how you did. So how did you do on that for response? And let me know when you can, whenever it's legal and the College Board allows you to come back and let me know how you did. Like I said, the biggest concepts that you need to understand that we didn't cover here, pretty much I try to cover most of them. The equations you already have, is those relationships, those key relationships you understand, things like bond prices and interest rates, they're inversely related. When interest rates go down, bond prices go up, and the other way around. Yeah, for the most part, I think I covered almost all of them in this little quick review session with you guys. I would watch my Everything You Need to Know video. Maybe if you have the time, go do one of those practice sheets in one of the units if you need like a little bit more time to study a specific concept. So if you just are junk at bank balance sheets, then just jump in really quick to the Unit 4.1, try those practice questions, or at very least kind of get your mind around them so you can go refer to them when you start your actual test if you need to. Thank you so much to people who got the Ultimate Review Packet. Thank you so much for watching my videos and letting me be your kind of quasi-online teacher for the last few months. You guys are going to rock this test. So all I can tell you is good luck. I am so proud of you. I'm so glad that you've done all this hard work at home. And, I think you're ready. And if you're not ready, you've got 2.5 hours to get ready. Thank you so much for watching my videos. As always, you guys totally, completely rock. And this will be the last time I'm going to say it to you. Tears, tears. Until next time.